as we keep going. Thank you for joining us on this Wednesday afternoon for what has been an incredible series of conversations about the Bill of Rights for criminalized workers. And I am joined today by an illustrious panel and a fabulous moderator. But first, I want to just introduce the concept of this Bill of Rights for those who haven't joined prior webinars, and then just share a little bit about how it came to be. So for those of you, most of you are advocates on this call, you know that over 70 million, and new reports are closer to 100 million people in the United States have a criminal record. And for people living with a record, their punishment is not limited to the court sentence. A criminal record produces a lifetime of barriers and exclusions, which are often called collateral consequences. But we know that these collateral consequences are not collateral at all. In fact, they've been intended by the system to keep people, and particularly Black and Brown communities, in a state of perpetual second-class citizenship or without citizenship at all. And that is voter disenfranchisement, loss of housing and healthcare, the disruption or lack of access to education, and discriminatory hiring practices. And the Working Future campaign was created as an economic justice campaign to begin to address and eradicate those barriers. And part of what the Bill of Rights for criminalized workers sought to do was to garner feedback from directly impacted communities from across the country to really think about what it would look like to have a working future. And, you know, hearkening back to the Black Panthers 10-point party platform, the Young Lords platform, to the more recent Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, we thought it was important to begin to codify these rights as we move forward in this movement, because it's not just about what legislation we see change, but how we begin to change people's hearts and minds. And before I introduce the panel, I just want to share a very exciting moment for the Bill of Rights for criminalized workers. Many of you may be joining us directly from watching the Fair Chance Act hearing that is going on right now in Congress. And New York's own Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez introduced the Bill of Rights as testimony in the hearing as to why ban the box should be passed at a national level. And so we now are on the record as a document that can be seen by all in this congressional hearing. And I just thank her staff for doing that and for putting these issues on the map. So I am just going to quickly introduce our panel. We have a really awesome panel today, including Victor Rios. He is a professor at University of California, Santa Barbara, the author of many, many books, including Punished, and I can't remember the last part of that title's book, and Human Targets, Schools, Police, and the Criminalization of Latino Youth. So thank you, Victor. James Monteiro, who is the founder and executive director of the Reentry Campus Program in Providence, Rhode Island, and Leading with Conviction Fellow 2018. And so thank you, James. And finally, Hakeem Crampton, Michigan's statewide organizer for the Working Future campaign, and someone who has had long experience in youth justice. So Thank you, Hakeem, for joining us. And lastly, I just want to introduce an amazing moderator, Vivian Nixon. It doesn't say on this slide what you're the executive director of, so that just means you're the executive director of the universe.
If only it were true.
We'd all be living better lives, that's for sure. But Vivian Nixon joins us as the executive director of College and Community Fellowship, as well as the founding director of the the Coalition for Education Inside Out. Is that?
It has been renamed, and I'm a co-founder along with Rita and Annie from Operation Restoration in New Orleans of the Unlock Higher Education campaign.
Fabulous. Thank you for clarifying that for me. And without further ado, we have a really interesting conversation for you, so I do not want to take up any more time talking, and I'll turn it over to Vivian to get us started.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to reiterate our thank you to the panelists who are renowned, each one of you in your own right. I have followed your work. I am proud to know you and humbled to be moderating this panel. I want to make a few recommendations. Check out, follow these folks on Twitter. They know what they're talking about. If you haven't seen the film Push Outs, shout out to Katie Galloway if she's listening. You should see Push Outs. It's an amazing film about this issue. So we're in this space today talking about the particular connections between the Working Futures campaign and access to education and technology, and specifically to higher education as a means to guarantee people a working future. I want to set the tone, though, by defining what do we mean by working future. In a lot of circles and historically throughout the reentry movement, since President Bush founded the Second Chance Initiative, the language around reentry has been very focused on human productivity, that humans are almost seen as a commodity, and to the extent that we can tool them to be productive workers in our society, that is a benefit to society. I would like us to turn that a little bit on its head and ask ourselves, how can society lift up human beings to live their best lives? And education is part of the way we do that. Of course, work is a part of living your best life, but work should also be an opportunity for you to explore your gifts and your talents and to make a difference where you want to make a difference. It should not be a prescribed set of opportunities for this particular population, that we can only do this, or we can be put in this box, or we can stand in that circle over there and not go outside the line. I just want to frame the conversation that education is a value unto itself, that it impacts our ability to have a positive and productive working future, but it is not the only reason to educate people.
Absolutely.
And with that, I'll start with this observation. It is the 25th anniversary of the 1994 ban on Pell Grants that came with the Clinton crime bill, the omnibus crime bill. As part of the deal that was made by President Clinton and the administration at that time, people in prisons became ineligible for federal aid to take college courses of any kind inside of a prison. Overnight, when that decision was made, the number of programs in prisons dropped dramatically from near or slightly over 300 down to less than 10. Since that time, there's been a burgeoning interest in reviving Pell Grants in prisons. I'd like to know, how do you think we got to this place where we have to fight for what is seen in many countries, and certainly by the United Nations, as a human right, the right to an education? Can everyone give me a brief response to that question. I'll start with you, Hakeem.
Thank you, Vivian. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, thank you. I think that how we got here has been a very systematic step throughout history here in America that has paved the way for the reduction of rights to marginalized groups in America. I think that the 1994 crime bill was just the christening, so to speak, of a long history of attempts and designs to remove opportunities for marginalized groups such as African Americans and peoples of color to have greater access to securing the fundamental rights that the Constitution guaranteed. And of course, as the Constitution was written and ratified, Black and brown people and other marginalized groups in America were not even included in that constitutional right. So there's always been a very design and a very clever attempt to find ways to marginalize even further peoples of color. And so I think that that's how we got here, that it's been a steady increase in ways to target and reduce the opportunities for peoples of color here in America to succeed and get ahead. And so that would be the way I would answer that question. I would say it's been a historical design to place us in this very position, this predicament we find ourselves in right now.
Thank you, Hakeem. James?
To answer that question, I would say it's been a lot of fear and misinformation. Fear in a sense where as though people do not understand what it is to be incarcerated or what it is to come home from incarceration, and there's been a lot of labels put on people that are caught up in the system. And misinformation is, I don't really think, even Clinton said, if there's two things that the Clinton administration has against it, it is the failure to act when there was a genocide in Rwanda, and then the failure to act in regards to the genocide that caused this mass incarceration problem caused to the African American and Latino communities in poverty. For them to continue to do this, I don't think if Clinton really knew what the backlash and what was to come of what he was doing, I don't think they would actively have put this legislation in place that removed all of these supports and all this access to education in the prison system. Knowing, because like right now, what are we seeing? A lot of these individuals that were caught up in this crime bill from '94, they're starting to come home now. And as a result of them removing education and support systems in the prison system, they're coming home with little or nothing to be able to stand on. So I think it's a lot of fear and misinformation that was propagated back then that caused them to be able to support this policy and this bill that went through.
Thank you, James. Victor, I'll give you the last word on this.
Well, you know, really the taking away of social services, the taking away of healthcare, education, the elimination of any kind of program that is meant to really support folks that are incarcerated, and then when they get out to not just have reentry, right? Because we got to think beyond this idea of reentry. We got to think about ideas like re-welcome, re-nurture, right? Because what's happening right now is that we're thinking reentry and we're putting the blame 100% on the person coming out. You know, it was your fault you went in. It's going to be your responsibility to pick yourself back up. And what that means is you yourself have to find a job on your own. You yourself have to come up with an academic credential to prove yourself in society. And you yourself have to pay your own rent. And so that sets people up for failure and devastation. And so taking away these opportunities for people really is a long durée. It's a part of history. I mean, people have talked about the 4 pillars of racial inequality for Black Americans, you know, slavery, Jim Crow, the ghetto, and then mass incarceration. But there's a 5th pillar coming, and it's right underneath our noses, and that is that as folks are released from prison, right, that 5th pillar, to me, starts to look at this idea of reentry and really bringing the prison out into the community, the spillover of the prison into community. You're seeing it with technologies of surveillance. You're seeing it with folks being allowed to be out and about, but with no rights. You're seeing it with the expansion of probation. You're seeing it with the increase of school resource officers all over high schools in America, right? And particularly in Black and brown communities. So this is a long array of history, all kind of folding into this new era of reentry. The other big thing that people talk about is, this idea of restorative justice, and that's been co-opted too, right? So now people, I see school districts, oh, we do restorative justice, we're helping kids out, we're helping people that are incarcerated once they get out, do restorative justice. But in reality, it might be just disguised in the same old stuff. And so what we have to think about is not just restorative justice as well, but also transformative justice, really transforming entire communities and institutions rather than just expecting individuals to change themselves.
Well, thank you. So the theme I hear in every answer is that this 1994 crime bill, and in particular, taking away opportunities for people to learn, to advance themselves, to take advantage of the wonderful education system and business opportunities and other opportunities that we boast around the world, that America is the land of opportunity, to strip those opportunities away from a whole segment of the population, and then realize that this population is disparately people of color and poor people, is an element of structural racism. And that is the theme that I hear, and it is the theme that I definitely agree with. I want to piggyback, Victor, on your notion that if we follow Louis Vaquan's, 4 pillars of racial discrimination, that 5th pillar, that bringing the prison into the community, is not a new idea. We have been talking about this since 2004. And I'll make sure that Megan gets a copy of a paper that a group of colleagues and I wrote in 2004 saying that this was coming, that the next step is going to be, they're going to turn our communities into a carceral state. So thank you for bringing that up. It's something that we should be aware of in our communities.
Vivian, I already have that paper and I will share it. It is one of the most brilliant papers I have ever read.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. 1971, ring a bell, everybody?
Yeah.
Attica. In 1971, the prisoners in Attica State Prison in New York stood up and said, we're not going to take it anymore. We need to be treated humanely. We need access to education and opportunity. And it was a shot heard around the world, literally. It was a shout heard around the world. It was many of the men in that prison who demanded some of the humanization that is law today. Not saying that every system, local, state, and federal system follows the law and treats people humanely, but it is codified in the law that people should have access to certain things while they are incarcerated. And as a result of that 1971 uprising, one of the things that happened was that education was proliferated throughout the system. And then again, in 2018, there was a prison strike, one of the largest prison strikes in recent history. And one of their demands was that Pell Grants, once again, be made available to people in prisons. Do you think that demand is radical or extreme, or do you think it's simply humane? I'll start with you this time, Victor.
Oh, I mean, it's interesting how when someone is accused, right, of committing a crime, all of a sudden, in this country, especially with Black and brown populations, they're accused of committing a crime or they're criminalized, as I've written about, and you get marked as a criminal before you even commit your first act of crime. So you got a teenager or younger than a teenager, a young Black boy growing up in the inner city, and he's already being pocket searched every day, stopped and frisked, right? Because to the officer, he looks like a drug dealer, right? He's too tall, he's young, but he's really tall. He looks like a teenager, even though he's still a boy. This adultification of children of color And then all of a sudden, this young man is socialized into understanding that the criminal justice system's already after him, and has already begun to socialize him, if you will. And so to get a mark prior to committing any kind of a crime already gives you all the drawbacks of the criminal justice system, and you reap no benefits of actually having committed any kind of crime if there is a benefit from committing crime. So with taking away, right, the human rights really is what we're talking about, of people when they're accused of committing a crime, what you essentially do is you strip them of their dignity and you take away any opportunity possible. So to request, right, hey, can we just have the right to a basic education while we're locked up so we could improve ourselves, right? That's just ground zero. That's just the very beginning. And that should be something that's provided to everyone, a basic college education. But beyond that, I have to say that we have to be careful when we demand or request just a college education, just a curriculum that gives us a degree. We also have to make sure we push for the development of intellectual and emotional growth. Because what happens is when you grow the intellect and emotional capabilities of individuals that are locked up, you get Malcolm X. You get people that are not just considered social junk by society, but you get people that are converted into social dynamite, that are transferred.
That's exactly right, Victor. What you get when you do that is you get thought leaders, right? You get critical thinkers. You get people who are going to contribute to the public discourse and the public dialogue. We saw that with Attica. So many people, once they got access to education, came out of Attica and became public intellectuals. My mentor, I would not be doing this work if it weren't for Eddie Ellis, who was, one of the main drivers of change inside the system. So I'm gonna not ask everybody every question, because I can, and if you disagree, say, I disagree and I'll let you speak, but I would venture to say that both Hakeem and James don't think that providing education in prisons is radical. It's just basically humane, which is something I think we can land on. Recent events have highlighted the role of the police in schools. Schools that serve students that come from the most over-policed communities. What must we take into account as we fight for access? What does education look like? We're fighting for access to Pell Grants, but there is another element of criminalization that happens even outside of the prison within our education system. I'd like each of you to talk about that. I know you have some experience with that, Hakeem, in Michigan, and then James and Victor, you can wind up.
Yes, absolutely. As we all are well aware of, there's been a criminalization of students, of kids in school, behavior criminalization, so to speak. And we persistently defined punishment in such a way that it's become normalized in America to discipline and punish our people. And when it comes to the school, the backdrop of the school, when you have an increase of African Americans, particularly in a school setting that is non-traditionally African American, you have a quickness to create disciplinary policies and practices because it's a normative in the society, born over from slavery, of course, born over from criminalizing and punishing Black and brown peoples in America. And so in the school system, when our children are repetitively being disciplined and punished for their behavior, and that behavior reaches to the level to which we're creating policies that pushes them out of school into a situation in which they're no longer being educated. Now they're ripe for access to prisons, as we call it, the pipeline to prison, because when I was in prison, 75% of people that came into the prison system didn't have an education. They were high school dropouts. So if we're able to push our children out of school, we're essentially pushing them on a pipeline right into incarceration. And so I think it bears directly upon our notion of discipline in society, how we've desensitized being restorative and transformative and treating children's behavior in ways that would be helpful and beneficial to them to progress and learn effectively. And so we've essentially demonized their behavior, criminalized their behavior, punished them to such an extent that we've then pushed them out of school along a pipeline that leads to incarceration.
Thank you. Victor?
Yeah, I mean, you know, this is right on point. I mean, there's a way in which, you know, we got to understand this history, right? I mean, when the criminal justice system started to crack down on communities of color really heavily, right? It's always cracked down on communities of color, but really militarized itself and then created technologies and really serious policy of mandatory sentencing, et cetera. What started to happen was that you had schools saying, hey, we want a piece of the action. What are you doing, criminal justice system, that we can use in our schools? And one big idea in the criminal justice system in practice was zero tolerance. Some viewers might be familiar with this idea. Now you see it at schools, on posters, on walls, on signs. Zero tolerance for fighting, zero tolerance for disrespect to teachers, zero tolerance for gang dress, gang behavior. So this zero tolerance idea comes into the school, and the school starts to resemble a prison. Now you follow it up with, in the 1970s, 30% of high schools had school-based resource officers. Today, over 75% of high schools in America have school-based resource officers. And of course, not to mention security checks, drug dogs, et cetera. All to say is there are very embedded practices in our schools right now where teachers, administrators, security guards start to think like the criminal justice system. And we have to reverse that, right? To reverse the school to prison pipeline, we have to start to re-socialize not just our students, right? Our teachers and our administrators to think like nurturing educators instead of thinking like criminal justice authorities.
Thank you. James?
One of my students, Vivian, he actually did a paper and he compared the symptoms of ADHD with the symptoms of PTSD. And if you would look into the DSM-4, you would notice that the same symptoms that are listed underneath ADHD, which they proclaim a lot of our kids had, which they're uncontrollable, they can't contain, put them on medication, put a police officer in the system. What I would say is a lot of symptoms of PTSD that are going on undiagnosed and untreated. And a lot of these kids are experiencing trauma. They have a lot of trauma going on in their lives. I work for the Institute for the Study and Practice of Nonviolence. We would sit out to school, and when I was in school, Vivian, you might have one kid say to me, "I'll see you after school." But these kids got whole gangs of kids waiting for them after school. And how are they supposed to concentrate and focus on their academics or be responsible in this setting when they know they have all of these issues facing them? Never mind their family situations, their family dynamics, never mind all the other stuff that they're facing. How are these kids supposed to focus? I think we should replace these SOR, these officers in the school system with more counselors. That's what needs to be what needs to happen within these school systems. These kids need help with trauma, not the quick fix solution that they try to do with mass incarceration, just lock everybody up or just put more police in the school system. Eddie Ellis said this. He said, what's the backlash of locking a whole generation up? And he said, you have gangs. You have an increase of all of these kids outside of society on their own, trying to figure it out. And what we do, instead of trying to give them the help and the healing, we remove the parents, we remove the staple of their support networks. And instead of giving them help and giving them support system, we put police into their system. And again, we just make it's just a self-perpetuating cycle. It just goes on and on. We're not treating the trauma of the parents. We're not treating the trauma of the kids. All we're doing is quick fix solutions would lock everybody up, and it's just not working. So that's my take on it.
Yes, and this is very connected to our nation's inability to see Black and brown children as children.
Right.
They are seen as a threat, no matter how young they are. Anytime you can turn on the news and see a 5-year-old black girl in Florida with handcuffs on because she had a temper tantrum in a classroom, could you imagine the uproar in our nation if that had been a little white girl that was handcuffed because she had a temper tantrum? I see little white kids have temper tantrums all the time. Nobody calls the police. We know that the Supreme Court has ruled in favor of the medical community that the brain does not fully develop. The reasoning part of the brain does not fully develop until age 24. Yet we are holding children accountable as adults for their behaviors. And unless we start addressing that, the school to prison pipeline will continue. So thank you so much for addressing that issue so eloquently, all three of you. Moving on. What is the importance of access to technology for people who are returning back to the community after jail or prison? How is that connected to both furthering education and having a working future? I'll start with Victor this time.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just essential. Learning, like right now, folks are learning from this webinar. We're learning from each other, and we need technology. It takes a lot too. You got to get, and my computer barely started up today to do this webinar. You know what I'm saying? Like, I barely have the equipment to do this kind of high-tech stuff. Now imagine folks coming out of the system. So there's a huge, technology gap out there. Access to basic internet. Nowadays folks have, an ability to ubiquitously have a smartphone on them, but do they have the right service for that phone that will get them, the streaming that they need to learn, and education, that's the future right here. You're seeing it right now on screen. This is the future of education. I always tell my students at the university, I'm tired of lecturing for 90 minutes at a time. The future of education is going to be, 15 minutes at a time. You come in, you watch the lecture either in vivo, live, or on the internet, and then you go and you talk to people. You build community. You engage in civic responsibility. That's how you learn, not listening to some, so-called expert for 90 minutes at a time, talking nonsense because they read a bunch of books, So like, people need technology, and we have to offer them that capability to have not just phones, but computers. And more importantly, I think, is access to a good internet connection. Because once you have that, you're able to access a world of learning that for the most part can be free, if not, at least affordable for folks coming out of the system.
Thank you. James?
Yeah, I mean, you could just see it on the ground level. It's like in Rhode Island and pretty much across the nation, every factory that I see, factory building, has actually been shut down and turned into condominiums. You have big companies like Benny's going out of business. Macy's has just left Rhode Island. And what's replacing these companies, and the reason why they're going out of business, is because places like Amazon, online ordering. You don't really need these places in order to operate businesses now. And that means the individuals that are coming home, if they do not have access to some sort of technology in prison, there's a huge disconnect that's going to happen to when they enter society. Even the GED test now is going online. There's people that are in a barbershop program in the prison here. In order for them to take the test, in order to get to go for their license, they have to do this test online. They cannot even take the test in prison anymore. So more and more stuff is going online, and yet we're telling people inside prison that they can't have access to it. So what happens when they come home? There's just a huge disconnect. You got people locked for 20 years. Cell phones have changed. Everything has sped up. Everything is sped up, and yet we want them to come home and be able to smoothly reintegrate back into society, but we're not providing them with even the basic of tools inside prison in order to be able to do so. It just makes no sense. We need to do better with that.
We certainly do. Hakeem?
Yes, I think what's pivotal here to include in this discussion is the fact that humanity, one of the greatest things about our ability to evolve and to continue the progress of civilization is to have the minds and the bodies to actually pass on generational knowledge to each other. And I think that that's one of the things that prison does. It actually stagnates humanity's progress. When we lock people up and deprive them of access to creative thinking, access to, in other words, technology that would allow them to then funnel that knowledge and information and experience back into society, back into civilization's progress, we're doing the greatest disservice to humanity. And I think if we look at what happened in Andalusia or Spain, for example, when the Moors of North Africa ruled Spain and essentially Europe for around 800 years. Once the Europeans came in, they were just coming out of the Dark Ages, and they came in and essentially destroyed the advancement of human civilization by kicking them out of Europe and back into Africa, and therefore ceasing the great progress that humanity had reached up to that point. And that's what we do in America. When we lock people up and lock them out of education, lock them out of being tapped into civilization and society and technology, then we're essentially crippling our ability to continue to progress civilization further.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I just want to add that there are two sides to the technology story, and certainly technology can be used to do tremendous good. And what we should not be supporting is ways in which technology is now proposed to be used to make money for a huge conglomerate corporation by monitoring our communities with devices that will not only be owned by folks who already are holding more than 2% of the wealth in this country, but the cost of that will be passed on to our communities. So we have to look at both sides of technology and convince those who are the innovators in technology to use their power and their knowledge for good rather than to use it to continue increasing the carceral footprint in America and continuing the piling on of layers of new peculiar institutions that only perpetuate the structural racism that already exists in America. I know we want to leave some time for questions, and what I'd like to see in the answer to the questions, if each of you could build into the answer to some of the questions we get, some of the work you're doing in your locality. What are you doing on the ground to combat some of the things that we've been talking about? Do we have any questions yet, Megan?
Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting myself, which is not true most of the time, which Hakeem well knows. Yes, we have a couple of questions, and I'll start with this one because I think it goes to the conversation we were having, particularly about youth, which is how can healing practices and restorative justice be taught from a young age? And what is the role of schools in doing so?
I would throw that to Victor because I know Victor's work, and I think it plays right into what you're doing so well.
Well, thank you. Can you repeat the question one more time? I was writing part of it.
Yes. How can healing practices and restorative justice be taught from a young age? And what is the role of schools in that process?
Oh, well, it all begins at schools. You know, schools can be liberatory places. You know, teachers, individual teachers can be life changers and lifesavers. I know you mentioned the film The Pushouts. In that film, you see my teacher saving my life, you know. So in terms of healing, you know, hurt people, right? So we got a society where our people are hurt, you know, racism, classism, capitalism hurts people. And so we have to find alternatives to racism, classism, capitalism, sexism, homophobia. And the way that we do that is we create mini utopias within our communities. And actually, we don't create them. We go and identify them. They're already there. You know, any hood you go to, I don't care how violent, how poor, how criminal people are saying it is, you find little pockets of utopia. You find grandmas, you know, growing corn. You find little kids helping each other with technology and sharing to do their homework. You find uncles taking care of their 6 little nephews whose all dads are incarcerated. Why don't we go and see how we can benchmark the practices of those communities and build alternative communities? And schools as well, we have to go look at those educators and institutions, right? Schools that have made a choice to be transformative, made a choice to be liberationist, made a choice to say, hey, we're teaching in a community where our kids are facing violence and poverty. Let's change that. Let's not only help them change themselves, but let's give them the skill set to transform their communities, and let's advocate for them and provide them the right resources. So yes, schools can 100% turn it around and become advocates for communities rather than standing there in the community and saying, we're going to teach you this material because that's what the state wants us to teach you. No, revolt as educators, as educators, and say to yourself, what is my purpose? How am I going to transform lives? And how can I help the children in my immediate community I'm teaching, rather than how can I follow every rule so I can get my next paycheck?
That's absolutely true. And just to put a fine point on it before we take the next question, you know, there's a whole body of work that's being done by organizations across the country where they are helping communities rely on themselves to solve their own problems. So instead of having a prescriptive response where the government or philanthropists come in and say, here's this program we're going to give you, and this program is going to help you solve the problems in your community, they're actually saying, no, actually let the community, give the community some resources and let them decide what to do with it. Let them decide what they need most. You may think they need this, but what may really work is if they have some green space in their community, or if they have, free daycare for working people who have to work almost round the clock just to make ends meet. So community solutions are something that we truly believe in here at College and Community Fellowship. And Victor, I thank you for, bringing up the point that our communities may have issues. They may be broken, but they're not destroyed. They're not helpless. They're not useless. There's a lot of capacity within our communities, and we just need to learn how to share that capacity with one another and be our own best resource.
They might be broke, but they're not broken.
That's right. That's exactly right. Megan, the next question.
And it's sort of remarkable how well this question fits in with where that conversation went. The next question is, in a state where education is often exclusionary, set up to create opportunity gaps, what are the roles of organic intellectuals in our community?
Whoa. Do you mind if I take that? Because I gotta go after this. I'm so sorry. And then
of course.
Wow.
If you could take it, James, and then let Hakeem get in on the end of it, that'd be great. I mean, not James, Victor.
Okay. Yeah. I'm gonna take off here. Thank you, everyone. But I'll just by answering this, because the organic intellectual is something I've been fascinated by ever since I was in grad school. My first publication, I'll try to post it online. Anyway, it's a long story, but it's about youth organizing, and I talk about organic intellectuals. And the point is this, that in organic intellectuals of the people, the community that's already thinking for the community, but researchers have, and book writers have forgot about, because somehow we have the stake in knowledge production. But in reality, there's people in the community always producing knowledge. There's always theories, ideas for how to create a transformative world in local communities. And so the role of the organic intellectual, I think, is to expose the wealth right, of ideas of our communities and practices in our communities, and really showcase them, whether it's through technology, through writing, through poetry, through art, and really showcase what folks are doing that's positive in the community, that's transformative, and then forcing the system to adopt those strategies. Like, you know, everyone's into this, you know, again, you know, it's a beautiful idea, right? This idea of transformative justice and of course, you know, restorative justice. But that was practiced by the Black Panther Party in the 1960s by Fania Davis, but everyone was ignoring her and what she was doing, what everyone was doing back then. And all of a sudden it becomes a fad in the 2010s. And now everybody wants to do, you know, restorative justice. So let's be real. Our communities have always had solutions, and organic intellectuals have to be the ones to expose those solutions, and we have to give them space to do so. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Victor.
Hakeem, do you want to add to that a bit?
Yeah, and it's not much more to add to what he said. But what I do want to preface is that when we think of the intellectual environment in itself, the educational system, the teaching environment, the exchange of ideas, I look at that as an ecosystem. You know, ecosystem is a very complex, you know, socialization of a lot of different biometrics, so to speak. And I think that that's how we need to see the emergence of the intellectual, the organic intellectual, as an ecosystem that, you know, needs itself it needs each other to feed off each other, to filter into that ecosystem so that every organism, so to speak, can get what it needs and could thrive and continue to evolve the human progress. So like I said, there's not much more to add on to what Victor has said.
Thank you. We're going to take the last question. I'll let James take a swing at that question, and then we'll wrap up so that we can not go over time. We know everybody who cares enough to watch something like this is a very busy person, because you're out there trying to make change in the world. So we want to keep you to the schedule. Next question, Megan.
Thank you so much, Vivian. And that is absolutely true. And this question actually fits perfectly in the work that I know that you're doing, James, both inside prisons and in the reentry campus program. And I've had the opportunity to bear witness to the radical nature of that program. The question is, can you say more about how education is healing for the sake of learning? How is this therapeutic for justice-involved individuals?
Oof. I mean, I have to go from my own experience. I mean, for the longest time, I always thought my glass ceiling was here. I literally thought something was wrong with me. I couldn't understand why I was going in and out of prison. And I would sit in my cell, I would look out the window, I would look at the guard, and I just couldn't understand why he was able to go home and have a normal life and I wasn't. And I had a self-defeating prophecy that I was living. I remember when I was released from prison, I went home, I seen a friend of mine, his name was Barry O'Connor. He was running the financial aid department at CCRI, and he was explaining to me what I needed to do to get back into school. And I just kept looking at him, Megan, and I was like, I stopped him in mid-sentence. I said, how the heck did you do that? He said, what do you mean? I said, how the heck? Because me and Barry, we went to the same school together. Barry was the guy that we would get in trouble because of Barry when we went down Brown University. And he was able to turn his whole life around and be able to achieve on a level that I never thought was possible for somebody like me. And by me seeing him, I said, how the heck did you do that? And he said, James, the more letters I got behind my name, the less my background in history mattered. And for me, Megan, it was a transformative moment that not only had I been lied to my whole life, more so, and even more importantly, I had bought into the lie, and I was lying to myself. You understand? And the most important thing that I could have done when I came home was defeat that self-defeating thing in my mind. It's one thing to have the barriers in society that we face, but it's entirely another thing to have the barrier in my own mind. I went back to school, Megan. I graduated with honors. I've been able to achieve on levels that I never thought possible for somebody like me. And all of this started because I saw it first in Barry. And now I serve the same purpose for others that Barry served to me. And hopefully by me getting education and serving this purpose, the people that I'm working with, they will in turn serve the same purpose for others that are coming after them. I don't know if that answered your question, but hopefully you understand.
The best answer to any question is a narrative. We live in a society that is very narrative in nature. And when we use our stories in a powerful way, under our own self-agency, rather than have other people tell our truths and tell our stories, there's no power greater than that. So it was the perfect answer. And I think that all of us who have been on this call today have experienced that moment where we became healed by knowing, healed by knowledge, healed by seeing our society for what it is and recognizing ourselves as fully human. On the screen right now, we're sharing a slide from Working Future's campaign. I am human. I am human even though I am a woman. I am human even though I may have been incarcerated. I am human even though I may be a 10-year-old crossing the border alone without an adult. I am human even though I have a mental illness. I am human even because I have addiction and domestic violence and other type of violence in my past. I am a human. And because I am a human, according to the documents that founded this great country that we live in, I have certain inalienable rights that belong to me. Thank you all for listening. And thank you, Megan, for putting this panel together. James, Hakeem, and Victor, in your absence, it could not have been a better conversation. I thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you, Vivian, for being such an incredible moderator, as always. I don't have the flyer with me, but the next session will be on the right to meaningful employment. And it will be a session that is led by all of us or none out of San Francisco. So thanks once again for joining us, and we hope to see you next time. Take care.
Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.